Today is May 22nd, 2017, and we're interviewing Father Justin Kelly. Hi, thank you for doing this. So my first question for you is, what led you to religious life?
Well, many things. I grew up in a Catholic family in a suburb of Cleveland, Ohio, and went to Catholic schools, and I had at least one religious sister in my community, my mother's sister, one of her sisters, Sister Patricia Ann, and my uncle was also a seminarian for many years, though he didn't become a priest. And I had no desire, I don't think, when I was in grade school to become a priest or join a religious community. But I recall when I was in my freshman year at St. Joseph's High School, which was run by the Brothers and Priests of the Society of Mary, or the Marianists. They're based in Dayton in this country. Before the school was just being built, and the principal and the other people who ran the school lived in a little house on the property, and I recall being there either my freshman or sophomore year to sign up for courses. And I just recall a couple of Marianist brothers, rather young, in their 20s, coming downstairs, and they were talking about something and laughing. And I had a sudden glimpse of a life that, was full of camaraderie, I guess you could say, and was just very appealing. Just one of those little flashes of something that you get early on. So I filed that away, but I had no intention at that point of becoming a priest or a Jesuit anyway. And by the time I got into my senior year in high school, I'd read a number of books, and in some of them, Jesuits were featured in Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited. Farm Street Jesuit Church, which I've since visited in London, was a place where the heroine goes to have a conference with a Jesuit about her marriage. And I had seen them come up in other places, and my dad had gone to a Jesuit high school and what became John Carroll University in Cleveland. So they thought highly of the Jesuits, and it popped into my mind one night, well, I could become a Jesuit. And I thought, well, that somehow put it in a different category than being a diocesan priest, and it had an appeal. So, as I said, my dad had gone to Jesuit high school and college and thought highly of the Jesuits, and I met one Jesuit priest when my family was visiting family friends whose son attended St. Ignatius High School, and happened that a Jesuit named Father Joseph Gillespie was there, and he could do magic tricks. He took a little rabbit out of my ear, and he did all kinds of other things. And I thought, ooh, isn't that cool? None of the diocesan priests I knew could do this. So all that kind of swirled around in the midst of it. But it was in my senior year in high school when I was planning to go on to college. I went over on a Saturday evening to go to confession in the parish church, which is a thing Catholic boys did in those days. And while I was preparing for my confession, or right after it, I can't remember, all of a sudden I became aware of the fact that I was going to enter the Jesuit order the following fall. I wasn't thinking about it. Suddenly it was just there in my mind, and it was as if it had already happened. It was a fait accompli. And it was kind of as if I had received the answer to a question I didn't know I was asking. Anyway, I don't know how long this lasted, maybe 5 seconds, maybe 2 minutes, no longer than that, surely. And I recall afterwards going across to the drugstore on the corner across the street from the church to reward myself for going to confession by having an ice cream sundae. And while I sat there spooning my ice cream, I thought, this is kind of weird. I never made a decision like this in my life. I wonder if this is right. Well, there had been a Marianist recruiting brother at school who had passed out little cards so you could indicate your degree of interest in the religious life. And if you say anything but absolutely no, I'm already married, you got an interview with the recruiting brother. And he gave a little list of things that were signs of religious vocation. So as I ate my ice cream, I went down the list mentally, and I said, well, do you get good grades? I said, yeah, pretty good. Are you of good moral character? About average, I guess. Do you want to serve God and your neighbor? I think so. Anyway, as I went down the list, I thought, well, I'd probably check off as well as the next guy. Anyway, that was the origin of my calling to the religious life. Again, it was several months later before I went over to St. Ignatius High School, where the Jesuits were, and broke the good news to them. They were not overwhelmed. But eventually I took my entrance tests. I can go on probably too long about this, but there was a young scholastic, a Jesuit who wasn't yet ordained, leaning over the switchboard when I came out from one of my interviews at St. Ignatius, and it happened. I had met him some months earlier when I was giving an original oratory in a speech contest at a local high school, and after I had given my original oratory on why the 6 counties of Northern Ireland should be reunited with the Republic of Ireland, all of which I had gotten out of a pamphlet that I imagine the IRA had produced. He came out following this and asked me, do you know what you're going to do with your life? And I assured him grandly that I did. I don't think I had any idea. But anyway, he was there when I was taking my tests, and he saw me as I came out, and he said, well, Kelly, so you did know. Well, I was flattered out of my mind that he remembered me. And that was Mr. James O'Reilly. And in the most recent part of our history together, we were together living at Loyola High School over on Fenkell and Pinehurst for 17 years, where sometimes he was superior and sometimes I was, but a very wonderful man. He's now out at Columbia Air. But anyway, that's my history with him and my introduction to the society. Period.
So you kind of already answered this question, why did you choose the Jesuits, but is there anything else you'd like to add?
Well, I suppose a good deal of it had to do with my sense that they were educators. And I told this story, I think, when I gave my Christian lecture a year or so ago, but there's a family story that when I was in my high chair, as a, whatever you are, 2 or 3 or 4, I was heard to cry out, "Give me ideas, ideas, ideas." I don't know where I got the idea of ideas, except that I might have heard my mother saying to me, "Now don't go getting any ideas," which made me think they were probably attractive, good things. But anyway, I had a great desire to learn and to know, and it seemed to me that entering the Jesuits would be an opportunity for me to do this, as indeed it was, as I began my 14-year course of Jesuit training, and then went on to other things. Anyway, that's a good deal of it, probably enough.
So you were kind of leaning into this, but can you tell us about your formation?
Yes, I can tell you a lot about your formation. What can I tell you that would be of general interest? You probably know the pattern of the Jesuit course of studies. We first enter the society. We have 2 years of novitiate, which involves spiritual training and, you might say, introduction to the religious life and the constitutions of the Jesuit order and things like that. And at the end of 2 years, you profess your vows, which are perpetual or intended to be. And then you go on, if you, like me, if you didn't have any college. Now, today people are not accepted generally if they haven't finished college. But anyway, I had 2 years of essentially liberal arts courses in the junior 8 and went on to study philosophy for 3 years in Latin. All at the same time working on finishing my bachelor's and getting a Master of Arts in English literature. And then after 2 years of Regency, where I taught at St. Ignatius in Cleveland, I went on to do 4 years of theology at Woodstock College in Maryland. Normally, someone from the Midwest, at least from our part of the Midwest, would have gone on to West Baden, where I had already spent 3 years as a philosopher, but I asked to go to Woodstock College, where there were several well-known Jesuit professors, John Courtney Murray, who wrote books on American freedom and its compatibility with Catholic teaching, books which at the time were considered so radical that he was removed from teaching. This was the 1950s. But then the Second Vatican Council came along, and he was chosen as a peritus, an expert to accompany a bishop to Vatican II, and at Vatican II, the gathering of the world's bishops formally approved and endorsed a statement on freedom of conscience, which was absolutely revolutionary in Catholic circles. That is to say, it reversed about 150 years of public teaching in which the Church says, yes, you must follow your conscience provided it agrees with what the Church teaches, but if it doesn't, then you shouldn't follow it. Well, at Vatican II, they said, no, you've got to follow your conscience even if it doesn't agree with what we say. John Courtney Murray was not wholly responsible, but in no small measure responsible for that. Anyway, he was one of the teachers, as was Gustav Weigel, a famous ecumenical theologian, Joseph Fitzmyer, a famous biblical scholar who has just died, and Avery Dulles, who became a mentor and a good friend and later became a cardinal of the church. Anyway, all these people were people I had heard about and wanted to get the benefit of, and so I went and studied theology with them and finally did what we call tertianship, which is a third year of novitiate. I did mine in Wales, to the west of England, where I spent 9 months and 6 days, and had the benefit of a really gifted spiritual director, a man named Paul Kennedy, now many years deceased, who was a delightful human being, not overly careful about certain matters of hygiene. You could read last month's menu off the front of his cassock, and was very funny in very many ways, but had that kind of remarkable insight that very few people do. And he, more than any single figure, I guess, in my training, told me things I needed to know about myself, mostly good, some needing improvement. And I still treasure them. Just a wonderful human being. If I could tell one little anecdote without boring you to tears, I recall a typical day. Some of us were standing around the coffee table in the refectory or the dining room. Father Kennedy came back from a retreat, and someone said, "Oh, Father Kennedy, we're surprised to see you back so soon." And he said, "Well, Fathers, it was the strangest thing." He said, "I arrived in Liverpool and went to the convent of such and such an order and rang the doorbell, and Sister opened the door and she looked at me in great surprise and said, 'Why, Father Kennedy, we aren't expecting you for another 3 weeks yet.'" He said, "Oh, but fathers, it was providential. I had hardly set down my bags when Sister came up to me and said, 'Oh, Father, it's so good you're here. There's someone you must talk to,' and so on." Well, his life was guided by providence, and as long as I was in tertianship, so was mine by him. And it was a very good experience, and I got to know some British Jesuits, and was sent out to do good around the British countryside in a way that was illuminating. Anyway, that's a capsule summary of something that obviously I could talk about for another 45 minutes about.
All right, so my next question, again, you kind of got into this, but what can you tell us about your academic background? Like you said, you were in liberal arts.
That's right, yeah. In those days, the Jesuit course of studies was based on a 16th century document called the Ratio Studiorum, or the Plan of Studies, which was very heavily into Greek and Latin classics, which were the big thing in the Renaissance and the era that followed. And so we did a lot of Greek and Latin, but we also did history, English, a very little bit of mathematics. I think I had college algebra and college geometry at the end of my math training. I went on from there again to study philosophy at West Baden. What was the question again? Was about my academic background. I did a master's degree in English Lit at Loyola, though most of the courses I took were in southern Indiana, a place we have then, which is now, by the way, it's gone back to its original incarnation as the West Baden Springs Resort Hotel, 1 mile from French Lick, Indiana, another urban center where there's a hotel and a casino. Anyway, I took summer courses at Loyola in Chicago, and I wound up having 2 degrees from Loyola, bachelor's and master's. I wrote a master's thesis on Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited, and anyway went on from there to do my theology studies, and after that did a PhD in English at Yale. So that's a short summary. I wound up actually in the middle of my Yale years. I came here for the first time to what was then the University of Detroit. Father Tom Porter, who was in the English department here, got me to teach a summer course in literary criticism. I arrived 2 days late because of making a mistake about the dates. And nevertheless, some students still showed up on the 3rd day. And I taught here for 6 weeks in the summer of 1970. And I had a really good experience. I'd never been in Detroit for any length of time before. And I really liked the place. And 2 years later, when I finished I hadn't finished, I was still working on my dissertation on 3 Shakespearean tragedies. I came here to teach because U of D wanted me, and no other place particularly did. So anyway, I landed here, and for 3 years, I guess I'm getting on to the next question. For 3 years, I taught in the English department, but U of D went through several financial crises back in the 1970s. And in the first one, about, 24 or 30 members of the liberal arts faculty were laid off because of budgetary problems and the fact that our enrollment had shrunk down from, 12,000 students at its peak in the post-war years to 9,000, and then it was going down further. Well, anyway, I was the last come to a department that at that time had, 23 full-time professors. We had a PhD program, and I was, last come is first to go when there's a downsizing, and that's what happened. So I lost my job the same year I completed my dissertation and got my degree. But we had a 1.5 year lead time to get another job, and it happened in the following year. A Jesuit who was teaching here in religious studies, Father Vernon Ruland, took a position out at the University of San Francisco, and suddenly there was a vacation, an empty slot there for someone teaching literature and theology. So I applied for that, and the university wanted to hold on to as many Jesuits as they could. So they hired me. I don't think they would have filled the position if I hadn't been there. But that's when I got my start in religious studies in 1975. Now, happened the following year, there was another financial crisis, and even more people were laid off. But the then dean moved various pieces around the board and managed to save my job for me. So I've been here, 42 years, I guess it is, in religious studies, teaching literature and theology. I miss some of the pleasures of teaching in English, not the writing courses, but the ability to do a whole course, say, on Shakespeare or Jane Austen or whoever, or even just to teach poetry and novels. But I do a fair amount of that, combining them with themes from literature. So it's turned out to be a very happy arrangement for me. I've always been an amateur theologian, and published at least a few things that I think are moderately good, and the place has been very good to me. So that's the story.
Great. So my next question is, what happened then that shaped what you do or who you are?
Oh my. Well, I've told you a lot of what, certainly the reading I've done has shaped a great deal of who I am. One of the books I read when I was in high school was by a former British communist, Douglas Hyde, who wrote a book called I Believed that described first his commitment to the communist outlook and philosophy, and he even went to jail during the Second World War because of his beliefs, but he became increasingly disillusioned with Soviet Russia and with communism, and underwent a conversion to Catholicism in around 1946 or so, and wrote a book called I Believed, and it recounted the whole story. And I read this and was very impressed by it. I actually got to see him once when he came to Cleveland to give a talk when I was a senior in high school, and subsequently saw him a dozen years later. And he and many other people who I read at the time, Evelyn Waugh, Graham Greene, C.S. Lewis, Christian writers for whom religion was very important, and who thought things through theologically, and all that tended to shape intellectually my approach to things. There are obviously many more ideas there. Again, my parents were devout Catholics. They weren't hyper religious. We didn't do the family rosary every night or anything like that. But I would say the Catholic faith was the most important part of their lives. My dad was a newspaper man, very active in union affairs. In fact, the Cleveland Newspaper Guild was local number one of the American Newspaper Guild, which later was part of the CIO, the Congregation of Industrial Organizations that later merged with the AFL, the American Federation of Labor. And my dad spent much of the time when I was growing up at meetings struggling with communist control of some local unions and things like that. And the church's social justice program, especially as it affected the rights of labor, was very much to the fore in his way of thinking. And I'm sure that that impacted me. And then the fact that my parents, my mother's family were all, very good Catholics and very good people who, lived the life and seemed to be happy about it, and all that I'm sure powerfully shaped, who I am. I could add very many more things, but that certainly is a significant part of it. Another rather interesting part, at least I think, certainly interesting to me, I was a kind of regular high school boy, and I did a very little bit of dating, but not very much when I was in school. I took dancing classes from a certain Miss York of Arthur Murray Incorporated, who had classes at a neighboring girls' school, Villa Angela Academy, and I and 6 or 7 other intrepid boys would make our way up the drive of Villa Angela just as school was getting out. Got a great deal of attention, wanted and unwanted, from the girls. Anyway, I took these dancing lessons and met a woman there who now, and for the last 60 years, has lived with her husband in Grosse Pointe, and is still a good friend of mine. Anyway, I recall my employer, Hyman I. Busney, the Jewish man who ran the Commodore Pharmacy, where I was a soda jerk, though I called myself a pharmacy clerk. It seemed to have more dignity to it. Said, when he heard I was taking dancing classes and he knew I was entering the Jesuits, he said, "There won't be any dancing where you're going, son." And that's true, and from the time I was 17 to the time of my ordination, about a dozen years later, I don't think I had a single conversation with a woman near my own age, certainly not a private conversation. I think I've made up for it since. But anyway, after I got ordained and did my degree, I came to New Haven, and it happened. This was the 1960s, the late 60s, and a lot was changing in the Catholic Church. Sisters who used to wear those bulky medieval habits, who nowadays when we see someone like that, we know she's a Muslim, but those days it was a sister. They began to dress like women, like the very attractive women, many of them were. And for the first time, it became possible to have social relations, with religious women. And I happened to live near a community of Dominican sisters who taught at a local high school, and would be invited over to celebrate Mass and have dinner with the nuns. And that was the beginning of, an interaction with women, which has been a very significant part of my life. It turned out I like women, and a lot of them like me, and all that has helped shape, I think, the development of my life. Certainly, when I try to imagine what it would have been like growing up in the Society of Jesus, maybe 20 years before I entered, it would have been a very different thing, and I think I'd be a very different person, and that's one factor, only one, but an important one.
All right, great.
Too much said.
No, not at all. So my next question, again, you already touched on this a little bit, but what led you to your role at the University of Detroit Mercy?
Well, again, it was a couple of financial crises that we survived. And the fact that having come here, it's funny, I interviewed at several places, including Georgetown University, and I'd actually, during my theology years, I had, on Thursdays the last year and a half, I had, with 4 or 5 other non-ordained Jesuits, gone into Georgetown and run seminars for the theology department. And actually, I didn't have him in one of my seminars, but one of my colleagues and friends, Otto Hens, had a young man named Bill Clinton in one of his. And understand Otto at one point was so impressed with Bill that he asked him, "Have you thought of becoming a Jesuit?" And Bill said very diplomatically, "Gee, don't you have to become a Catholic?" anyway, uh, I had an interview at Georgetown, and I missed a plane, and the interview did not work out well anyway. They wound up not accepting me. The main reason, too, I wanted to go there, my parents at that time lived outside of Washington in Arlington, Virginia, and it would have been very handy. But I came to U of D, and as I said, taught English for 2 years. And my first year, I got a letter from the then president of Georgetown, Tom Fitzgerald, who said he didn't know what happened in the interview. He was sorry that they didn't offer me the job. But he said if I would, might say, work out in the Bush Leagues for a couple of years and improve my batting average, I could apply again and see if Georgetown would accept me. Well, I read this letter. I will do no such thing. And by that time, I liked it here. I suppose temperamentally, I'm one of those bloom where you're planted people, but I had made friends and liked the school and liked the whole ambience and so on. So anyway, I was glad to be here. So when this opportunity arose, again, I can recall during that period when I was without a job, I went into the then president, Malcolm Caron, and suggested that maybe he could give me a joint appointment in English and religious studies, something like what my friend had. Well, he didn't have any joint appointments to give, and I know he talked vaguely about maybe I could work in campus ministry and be an adjunct in the English department or something. Well, that didn't appeal to me. But then my friend Vern took this job, and I applied for his job and got it, and as they say, the rest is history. Of course, much history, but interesting part of it. So that led me to that.
All right. Okay. So my next question is, how has your ministry changed over the years?
How has my ministry changed over the years? Well, in one way, it's been a continuous process. I, for years, was one of the main celebrants at the Sunday evening liturgy here on campus, so I would do that, and I became a spiritual director for a lot of people, especially religious women in the Detroit area. I gave a number of retreats in different places. Over the years, I've done fewer things in the way of retreats, and since about the year 2000, when Art McGovern, who was a much admired and beloved faculty teacher in philosophy here, died of cancer, I was asked to step in to take his place in the Sunday noon liturgy, where a group of people have been gathering since the 1960s from all over the city, including some from the university. And the group has aged and shrunk dramatically over the years, and there are now maybe 15 or 20 people who come regularly. But having either attended or celebrated the liturgy there every Sunday for the last 17 years, I've gotten to know everybody in the community, and have, on the rare occasions when there have been baptisms, I've baptized children and have celebrated funerals, and generally, provided a listening ear to people who needed one. And that's proved to be very satisfying. I still sometimes, but rarely celebrate Mass in parishes or do things like that. I also, since about 2010 or 2011, every fall I do a seminar out at Manresa Jesuit Retreat House in Bloomfield Hills, and I guess roughly 30 people, more or less, come and take things that are generally literary, theological, or things in which I gave a seminar a couple of years ago in which I tried to evolve my own theology of the church as it is now. I don't know how to say this in any very succinct way, but I was very much affected by the changes of Vatican II and by the theology that emerged in the church after the Second World War, especially that of Karl Rahner. And this gives me a different perspective on the church and on life than many people have who come from more traditional views. Like a number of other Jesuits, I was unhappy with many features of the papacy of Pope John Paul II, a brilliant, gifted man and a holy man, and did many very positive things, but his outlook was, it seemed to me, intellectually quite backward in many ways, and that he thought of Catholicism, I'm sure, in terms of the Polish church he grew up in before the war. And it seemed to me that in many ways it was not the way I thought about God's action in the world. And the arrival most recently of Pope Francis has, given me a new sense of hope for the church, that it seems to be more moving in a direction that I think is the one that God wants us to go in. That's a kind of a complicated and tortuous answer to your question, but it's the best I can do.
This is very interesting because I know so many people just absolutely adored Pope John Paul II and his teachings.
Yes, right. Yeah, and a very fine man, but I recall when he died back in 2005, was that it? There was, of course, a great deal of adulation in the newspapers and so on, and I remember remarking in a homily, I said, all this papalatry brings out the Protestant in me. Well, there was a Polish man who was a member of our congregation, Dick Tarnas, sitting in the front row, and he said, "You wouldn't say that if you were Polish," he said. I said, "Probably not, but I'm not." I admire him. I can say many things, and he's a world historical figure who did wonders in bringing an end to the Soviet Union, but honestly, within the church, he was a disaster. He was a disaster from which we are slowly recovering. It'll take a long, long time. Again, the church reckons by centuries and God by millennia, so just have to be patient with the process. Let me just say something here, too. I gave this past Sunday, I'm expatiating at large, I suppose. This past Sunday, I was preaching at our Sunday liturgy, and I was hard put for a topic. And as I looked at the readings, I read all kinds of commentaries, and nothing came to me. And then suddenly I remembered that Father John Stoudemire, who shares the duties here of the Sunday Mass liturgy with me on alternate Sundays, he had given a talk down at the Detroit Athletic Club to the Jesuit alumni last Wednesday, and he began by saying, "I'm often asked why I became a Jesuit." He said, "That's not an interesting question." He says, "The interesting question is why I remain a Jesuit." Now, as far as I can remember, he didn't answer that in the course of his talk, but I thought, that's something I can talk about. So I connected that with the readings and talked about the way in which the people who have most influenced me, beginning with my parents, but also my teachers, my Jesuit colleagues and friends, have become so much a part of my life that I can't imagine myself without them. I couldn't walk away from them without walking away from myself. There are other reasons, I hope good ones and theological ones that I could use, but that is the case for me. There are these people whom I love and who inspire me. Avery Dulles, who I mentioned before, who a very interesting man. You probably don't know him. He died 8 years or 9 years ago now, in his early 90s. Came from a very conservative Republican background. His father, John Foster Dulles, was Secretary of State under Dwight Eisenhower, and his brother, Alan Dulles, I think, was the first head of the CIA. Not his brother, his uncle. And he, in some way, was a very rather stiff man. He had gotten polio as a child. And when I met him, I thought he was the most socially awkward man I'd ever met in my life. But I had him as a teacher in my first year, and he was brilliant. He was better than John Courtney Murray. He was better than anybody on the faculty. And beginning in my second year, I just used to take walks. We were way out in the country, and used to take walks in the afternoon. One day I wound up by the side door of the house just as he was emerging with a walking stick in hand, and he said, "Would you like to walk with me?" Well, I said, "I'd be glad to." Well, anyway, we got in the habit of taking walks, and I often say half the theology I learned at Woodstock I learned on walks with Avery Dulles. He would be walking along, and he would be pulling on his chin, and in his deep voice would say, "Now the bishops at Vatican II said Jesus wanted the church to be run by bishops." Well, he would chew on that for several minutes, and then he would stop and look at me, and he said, "You know, I don't think Jesus thought too much about bishops. I think he probably wanted the church to be well run." He left it open whether bishops were a help or a hindrance. Well, I got to know the man, and I just love him. He could be stiff, and in his late years he became very conservative, more conservative theologically. But he probably the greatest human being I've ever met in my life. And people like that, when they impact your life, it can't remain the same. So.
All right. So the next question is, how does a Jesuit charism influence your work?
Well, I just read a book by an Australian Jesuit called "What Does It All Mean?" And then he has one chapter on St. Ignatius and says, there's a saying, a Jesuit can't give a talk without talking about St. Ignatius, and I suppose I'm one of those. And I visited Loyola when I was finished my tertianship in Wales. A friend of mine was being ordained in Madrid, and then I went from there to Loyola, where Inigo underwent his conversion back in the 1520s, and was very thrilled to be in the same room where this thing had taken place in 1521 that was still impacting my life in 1968. Anyway, it affects me in ways that are hard to measure, but I would say the big thing is that the Jesuits have a certain optimism about God, about life and the world, and while we're well aware of sin and failure, we believe that Christianity and life are ultimately about the same thing and can be harmonized. And I guess the fact that, especially in places like this and in universities across the country and around the world, Jesuits seek to bring together the best of secular learning with the best of theological thought, and struggle with the problems that any serious person has to struggle with to maintain a reasonable faith. That's one way, maybe only one way, in which the Jesuit charism affects me. But there's a spirit about the society. Gary Wills had a piece in the New York Review of Books not too long ago about Jesuits, good and bad, and I read about this and I said, well, I've met a few that I am not terribly fond of, but the majority have been sincere, honest, good-humored people who believe deeply and who give their lives to others. And I like to think I share in that, though. There are many people who devote their lives to, ministries like Greg Boyle with gangs out in East Los Angeles. I couldn't imagine doing that, but just being connected with them is something that makes me proud and pleased. Anyway, I could go on at quite boring length about this, but let me just say one more thing. I think probably the best article I ever read was on called "Prayer and the Incarnation," and it involves an attempt to interpret what it means when we say that God became human in Jesus, and I talk about a process that takes place in the life of Jesus, which is expressed, though in language he wouldn't have used, in the prayer that climaxes and ends the spiritual exercises and the contemplation on divine love at the end of the fourth week of the exercises, where Ignatius says, tells the one making the exercises, call to mind the many blessings you have received, and then make an offering of yourself as one moved by great feeling. And he presents this prayer: take, Lord, and receive all my liberty and memory, all my understanding and will. Everything I am and all I possess, you have created and given to me, and I turn it over to you to be used and disposed as you would have it. Only continue to love me and give me the power, the will, and the desire to love and serve you in return. This is all I ask. Well, that prayer, the Suscipe of St. Ignatius, is kind of a guiding idea of my life. And in this article I mentioned, I argue that the man Jesus offered his human life to God in such a way that it becomes the life of God. I use many pages to try to explain this, but the Ignatian idea that is behind it of self-donation, and at the core of Ignatius is what is said there at the beginning of that contemplation to attain divine love. He says, love consists in two things. First of all, it's a matter of deeds more than words, and that love consists in a mutual sharing of gifts. The lover always gives to the beloved, and vice versa. And that seems to me true of Jesus. It seems to me it's part of what I like to be true in me.
So can you tell us about an experience that informed your ideas about social justice?
Probably not. Because I can't point to such an idea. I mentioned my father's involvement in unions, and his deep concern for the poor come from a family that was not only Catholic but very democratic in politics. Of course, it was the era of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and I used to think my mother, who was not, unfortunately, she was a brilliant woman, but she had no education beyond the second year of high school when she had to go to work. She was the oldest girl of a family of 8 or 9, but she grew up in a kind of an Irish Catholic ghetto, and I used to think that she thought God really intended all people to be born Irish, Catholic, and democratic. I never believed the Irish part, and I've gradually liberated myself from the Catholic part. I still tend to think she was right about the Democrats. Anyway, in matters of social justice, I found two areas have been of significant importance to me. One has to do with women, and the other with gay people. There are many more, and obviously living in Detroit, question of minorities and of African Americans in particular is something that's on all our minds and plates, so to speak. But I guess my experience, starting with my mother being a very, very smart woman, though she didn't have the educational opportunities she might have had in a later generation, and then my later encounter with women, religious and theologians, and just ordinary people, made me instinctively inclined to favor women's issues and to be aware of some of the ways in which they are disadvantaged in American society. Here's a tangent for you. Today, for no particular reason, I broke up thinking about Virginia Woolf and what I would have said to her to keep her from committing suicide back in 1941. and one of the things would have been to talk about how her books would have inspired part of second wave feminism in the 1960s. I still find the church's attitude toward the non-ordainability of women backward looking and theologically naive. It's just wrong. It's just plain wrong. And eventually, as with everything else, we'll get around to saying, well, we didn't really mean that. And anyway, I like to be a kind of a voice for change and a support to people. I know a very good friend of mine, a convert to Catholicism, eventually left the church, I think because of the church's attitude to women. Now John Paul, the late John Paul, St. John Paul, wrote a very beautiful encyclical on the dignity of women, and I know respected them in his own mind, but didn't quite see them the way I do. So that's one issue. The other has to do with, with homosexuality. I didn't know anything about. I didn't even know the existence, I don't think, of gay people when I was growing up. And my novice director, Father Bernie Wernert, who was what you would not call him a liberal by any stretch of the imagination, but I remember him giving a talk to us as novices in which he mentioned the fact that there were some people who were oriented toward those of their own gender rather than the other gender, and offered a few thoughts about what that meant in terms of Jesuits. Well, when I heard him talk about this, I thought, gee, this must be a very rare sort of individual. I will probably never meet any of them in my life. I'm amazed at my naivete, but what did I know at 17? I later learned that a beloved aunt and an equally beloved uncle were gay and lesbian, and that a good many of the people who entered the society with me, many of whom are still alive, are undoubtedly gay, though I've only had one Jesuit in my lifetime who has explicitly said so to me, maybe two, but I know they're there. They're there in large numbers, very large numbers. And I'm aware of all the opprobrium and all the difficulty. A good friend of mine, Tom Nelson, had a son who attempted suicide, and because he was gay, and discovering this led his father, who was a very conservative Catholic at the time, to become a very active promoter of tolerance, understanding, full equality for gays and lesbians. He and his second wife, Linda Carley, are active members of Fortunate Families, which is the Catholic version of PFLAG, Parents and Friends of Gays and Lesbians. And I identify with this way of thinking. Now the church, again, is still operating out of a natural law theology that says, well, God created men and God created women, and he assigned these roles to them, and there are these rules that apply to them, and nothing can change that, and so on. It's just impossible. But I mean, that's the way people used to think, and still some, many do. And I have come to the conclusion myself that the that the idea that homosexuals are intrinsically disordered is a mistake. I call it a deeply rooted cultural prejudice masquerading as the law of nature and the will of God. A deeply rooted cultural prejudice masquerading as the law of nature and the will of God. This is officially heresy right now, but I am as certain as I could be that if not in my lifetime, within 50 years, all this will have gone away and we will say, oh, we never really said that. Of course we did. So, in short, I suppose it was my coming to learn about these things that has made me, promote these things through what I teach and in private ways too. So, I think that's the best answer I can give.
Okay. So the last question is, what do you think the future of the order and the church will be? You touched on that a little in your last question, but is there anything else you'd like to add?
Well, that's interesting. The church is changing and the order is changing. I am glad to know that especially in countries in Asia, in Africa, and some other parts of the world, we are increasing in numbers, and there have been more novices entering in our provinces here in the last few years than I would have expected. All I can say is there will be very considerable changes that will take place. I hope the spirit both of the order and of the church I'm sure will continue to live, but in very changed circumstances. And I'm glad to have been a part of it as far as I can be here and now, and to support other people who struggle with their own faith, trying to make Catholicism real in their lives. I'm not answering your question very well, but the future has never been my best and much better on the past. But anyway, I'm hopeful. I do believe, in spite of Donald Trump, that social change is largely irreversible. It often goes in fits and starts and goes backwards for a while and then goes forward again. And I think that's going to happen. And I see a coming together that I hope will extend not just to the church but to the world.
All right, thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Marika. You've been a fine
Thank you.
interviewer.